My name is Kane. And my name is Billy. And today we're learning about the Pacific War and how it affects us now. Let's get going. So, before this war began, there was a previous war that the Japanese were all tied up into. That war was called the Sino War. It was an attempt by the Japanese to cut off China's supply. They succeeded, but it wasn't so good for China. After that war, the Japanese showed aggression in the Dutch East Indies and the British Malaya. Due to that aggression, the US placed an oil embargo on the Japanese, and the Japanese predicted that they wouldn't last more than 2 years without the fuel that they needed. The US left them with no other choice but to invade the Dutch East Indies and the British Malaya to supply them with the supplies that they needed to sustain themselves. But there was one problem. The Philippines were in the way, and the Philippines were controlled by the US at the time. So if the invasion of the British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies provoked the US into a war with the Japanese, the US could easily cut off Japanese supply. So US involvement was crucial for this invasion to go ahead. But it didn't really turn out that way. Japan had a different way to handle the situation. They decided that they would take out most of the US fleet, and most of the US fleet were landed at Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese went ahead on the attack, and the attack saw the light of day on the 7th of December 1941. As a result of this tragedy, 160 US sailors and US ships were taken down. And since this attack put the US to a freeze, the Japanese bought time to invade the Dutch East Indies and the British Malaya. But there was another problem. The Japanese didn't know that the US were big in the industry and they could rebuild their fleet very fast, and just in a matter of 18 months, they were back on their feet running back into war with the Japanese. But during that time, it gave the Japanese time to invade the Dutch East Indies and the British Malaya. It was quite easy for them because in previous air raids during the Pearl Harbor attack, they took out most of the Dutch's fleet as well as Britain's. So it was quite easy for the Japanese to occupy those countries. And then came the Philippines. So since most of the US fleet were gone at the time because they were back repairing or dead, it was quite easy for the Japanese to make a move. And just in a matter of days, the Japanese took over the Philippines. But after the attack, the Japanese had the supplies that they needed to sustain themselves. But during the attack on the Philippines, the commander of the local US forces, General MacArthur, made a last-minute escape to Australia and vowed that he would come back and take back the Philippines. It's important to note that before the Pearl Harbor attack, President Roosevelt Franklin approved the creation of the Manhattan Project. The purpose of this project was to research the military uses of the newly discovered phenomenon of nuclear fission. Whether they knew it or not, this project was going to be the cause of the tragedy at the end of this war. But back to where we were. Over the course of the next couple months, a couple smaller wars took place. During these small battles, the Japanese were very determined in what they were doing. The Japanese would suicide bomb. They'd also fly their planes into US troops as well as ships. During these wars, General MacArthur came back from Australia and fulfilled his promise to take back the Philippines. And again, in a matter of days, the US occupied the Philippines once again. Because of Japan's fierce resistance, the US decided that they would firebomb air raid Japan to force them into submission. While this air raid was going on, the atomic bomb was in its final stages of development, and it was approved for use on Japan in late July 1945, 5 months after the air raid. August 6, 1945. The US dropped the first ever atomic bomb in a war on Hiroshima in Japan. After the attack on Hiroshima, the Japanese still wouldn't surrender. And so, 3 days after, August 9th, they dropped another bomb on Nagasaki. The Japanese were out of cards to play, and the Japanese unconditionally surrendered. And the Pacific War had come to an end. So, what does this mean for us now? How does this conflict affect us now? Well, during the war, the US placed many radio beacons around Japan to listen in to the radio broadcast and predict where the Japanese troops were going to be, and the US would ambush them. All this information was sent to a station in New Zealand, and the station in New Zealand would send all this information off to different countries like the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia. This alliance was called Five Eyes. The Five Eyes Alliance still exists to this day. In fact, right now they've got 5 satellites in the sky orbiting Earth right now, collecting all your data and sending it to the same station in New Zealand and sending it off to these different countries. They're actually sent into supercomputers. These supercomputers narrow down all this data into keywords like terrorist, drugs. So, in my opinion, I think this is just a good thing. This alliance is keeping us safe from all these tragedies. Sadly, that's all the time we have for now. Thank you. Bye.